All right, today we're talking about advice overload, why everyone is giving advice and why everybody's seeking advice and why everybody's drowning in advice. Because we live in the cultural apex of unsolicited instruction. Advice has become the default genre of public discourse, not just online, but interpersonally. And what once emerged from mentorship or intimate counsel from people who knew you in real life now saturates this algorithmic feed that everybody's plugged into. And everyone's either giving advice or consuming advice or just quietly drowning in this advice. And I want to examine the structural origins of this flood of advice and why we create it, why we crave advice, and how it is reshaping our agency and our cognition and our adulthood in real time. So, how did advice content become a thing? So, the rise of advice content, advice as content did not become dominant because people grew wiser and all of a sudden there's all of this great advice to give. Advice content became dominant because platforms began to reward it. There was a book called The Culture of Connectivity in 2013 by Jose Van Dyke. And Van Dyke, he outlines the fact that social media architecture shapes not only what we consume, but what we perform. So advice performs well because it's digestible, it's emotionally relevant, it's searchable, and it's narratively unnecessary. So a book that we've mentioned multiple times, Erving Goffman, in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he describes behavior as dramaturgical. We have a video that discusses this a little bit deeper, but advice giving, me giving advice, people giving advice, functions not to transfer knowledge, but to stabilize the speaker's identity as wise, to reinforce themselves as one credible, worthy of giving advice. It is a performance of coherence, a signal of resolution in a culture allergic to uncertainty. And then finally, a book by Alistair MacIntyre called After Virtue, 1981, saw modernity as morally fragmented, as lacking shared traditions. And so in the lack of these shared traditions that MacIntyre describes, we default to technocratic prescriptions, and advice becomes a simulacrum of virtue. Useful-looking fragments detached from any coherent understanding of the transcendental good. And so why do we seek so much advice? Well, if advice dominates because it scales, we consume it because it relieves us of strain. The informational burden of modern life is overwhelming. Barry Schwartz talks about this in his book, The Paradox of Choice, 2004. Increased options produce paralysis, not liberation. And advice is cognitively efficient. It reduces the scope of internal deliberation. There is two scholars, Kahneman and Tversky. They work on this notion of bounded reality, and it confirms this, that humans are not designed to optimize decisions. We are built to conserve effort. So advice allows us to borrow judgment from others in moments of overload. The more we can treat wisdom like we're putting Legos together rather than material that we are fabricating from scratch, the more optimized that process is for how we're wired to relate to reality neurologically. But there's also a generational factor. We need advice, and we're looking for advice because we were not really raised well. Many generations weren't raised well, but people raised by baby boomers, particularly on average in general, were not given the skills of adulthood at a rate that is probably higher than any other generation in history. And there's a book that outlines this. Well, there's a really good book called Generation of Narcissists that I do recommend. A Generation of Sociopaths that by a guy named Bruce Gibney that I really recommend. But there's another book that actually details this more at a sociological level named Frank Ferretti. And he argues in this book, Paranoid Parenting, 2001, that parents of the late 20th century, having themselves rejected authority, failed to transmit practical adulthood to their children, who would be millennials. And millennials really were not taught the model of adulthood. They were taught to delay it. And there's this whole meme about how adulting is hard, right? And it doesn't reflect immaturity. It reflects something that we've inherited. So if we go like way back, and I'm talking like Socrates, we go back to Plato's Socrates, he offered the inverse of this. So in the Apology, Socrates refuses to give advice. And there's a wisdom in that. Socrates, he interrogates. His goal is not to provide guidance. His goal is to restore agency through disciplined self-examination. Advice for Socrates is a temptation away from moral self-authorship. So we have to remember what the function of advice for us today as a coping mechanism, because advice now is not just a path of wisdom. Receiving advice, the experience of having somebody else just tell us what to do, is affective regulation. Advice is not just a cognitive shortcut. And shortcuts aren't bad, but advice serves the function of a cognitive shortcut. And it's not just this. Advice is also an affective regulation tool, an emotion regulation tool. And Sigmund Freud describes it this way. He observed in his study of repetition compulsion, 1920, humans revisit familiar dynamics not to resolve problems, but to reduce tension. This is similar to Carl Friston's free energy principle. Advice functions similarly. It soothes the existential pressure of choice. Another book we've mentioned a dozen times probably is Byung-Chul Han's book, The Burnout Society, 2010. He describes modern individuals as trapped in the imperative to optimize, trapped in the administrative self, and advice provides temporary relief. But over time, the surplus of advice becomes a source of psychic depletion, because the more we absorb, the less we actually author. Michel Foucault talks about this in The Hermeneutics of the Subject. In the 80s, Foucault contrasts classical practices of self-care with modern regimes of confession. So this ancient concept of parrhesia encouraged self-stylization, whereas modern advice often mimics confession. It's a surrender of authorship to an external norm masked as empowerment. And seeking advice becomes a ritual of dependence, not a practice of refinement. And it's all about the mindset that you bring. So, what is the net effect of our advice as content culture? Well, the upside of advice is that, and the saturation of advice in our lives is access. Access is huge. Access to information is a net positive. So instruction was once locked behind lineage and gate-kept, behind institutions and behind family power and behind money, but it's now available to anyone with any bandwidth. And this creates an asymmetry because those who metabolize advice effectively can scale faster than ever. Advice becomes not just knowledge, but leverage. So there's, in systems theory, there's a scholar named Niklas Luhmann. And Luhmann, he reframes system theory in this way. He says, meaning does not reside in messages, but in their absorption. He has a book, Social Systems, 1995. So for Luhmann, advice is inert until it enters a processing system, which is your internal psychological processing system. Those without filtration get buried. Those with filtration who know how to receive what is only relevant to them and implement it in their lives accelerate. So I want to mention one more scholar, which is Jürgen Habermas in his book, Theory of Communicative Action. And Habermas distinguishes between communicative action, which is rooted in mutual understanding, and strategic action, which is oriented towards manipulation. So most advice is a strategic action. It's oriented towards manipulation. It seeks to move and to persuade and to scale, not to understand. And learning to differentiate between Communicative action and strategic action, learning to differentiate between these two things is now a survival skill in the attention economy, where advice is packaged as advice content rather than as advice itself. So, pace and the pace of your own upskilling and self-improvement and self-development is no longer about willpower. It's about system architecture and your ability to exercise discernment, which really brings us full circle back to this concept of discernment. Discernment as discipline. And why is discernment? Because we think of discernment as a cognitive skill, and it is that, but it's also a matter of willpower. So it's a muscle as much as it is a skill. So it is easy to turn our brains off and say, this guy says to do this, I'm just going to do that. But we are not merely surrounded by advice. We are engulfed by it and platformed and aesthetized and fed back to us, a surrogate for authorship, so that our self-authorship is eroded and replaced and erased. So the task, though, is the temptation is to say, I'm going to do digital detox, get off all this stuff, but that's just not going to be practical as life moves forward. The world marches on. You cannot embrace digital retreat as a strategy for self-authorship today. The world will force you to integrate. You cannot be a Luddite. So the task is not to reject advice or even to reject advice content. It's to learn how to interrogate it and to be further grounded in your own self-principles. So when you look at advice and you hear advice content, and remember, we're distinguishing between advice and advice content, we have to ask ourselves, does this advice content clarify or is it performing? Does it perform? Does it clarify something for me or does it perform something for them? Does this advice increase optionality for me or does it induce conformity from me? Does this advice name friction that I would have implementing it, or does it bypass it and pretend that it's all easy and that all I need to do is this X, Y, and Z? Because most advice is just noise. A small portion is structure. And the rarest tier of advice is leverage. And that's what you have to filter for. Your goal is to create a filtration system to bypass 99% of advice content to get you that 1% that is for you digestible as leverage in your system, in your life, for your goals. Advice will not make you wise, but the discipline of discernment just might.